The most perfect philosophy of the natural kind only staves off our ignorance a little longer, as perhaps the most perfect philosophy of the moral or metaphysical kind serves only to discover larger portions of it. End quote. David Hume, you're listening to Socratic Smarts.
Here is the point. Here is the point. Here is the point.
Tap the volume and go down on the other side. Pick up it from. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the point. Here is the point.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight and whether this is quite authentic.
Welcome back, listener, to Socratic Smarts. It is a pleasure to have you back. And yeah, I got to say, man, it's a lot of opportunity cost, right? With podcasts these days. There's so much to listen to, as I have mentioned. And, it's just great. I love it. Thank you for coming back. If you do like the show, do you have some questions, what's going on in your philosophical brain, you want to get in contact with the show, I might read them out on the show, who knows what's going on. So I have no idea what this show is. It's still developing. And so if you do want to get in contact and give some feedback and maybe have some influence on what's going on, behind the scenes, that'd be interesting. I mean, that's how kind of media is developed these days. So I'm open to it. Hit me up at socraticsmarts@gmail.com. But enough jibber jabber. Today's topic is, of course, as you can tell by the title, on the topic of rhetoric. And what is rhetoric? What do we mean by rhetoric? If you've never heard that term before, let's just introduce it as just a definition, just the understanding of how I'm going to use that term in this episode. So we can all identify the difference. We talked about conversations previously, and we can all identify the difference between trying to sincerely engage with someone and someone who is just sort of spinning a narrative or just sort of using language in a way because they have a very deep and eloquent grasp of the English language or whatever language they're using, of course, but they have a very deep understanding of how to construct sentences which are emotively compelling, how to elicit the responses of fear. If you're a lawyer and you're defending your client, it's very useful to, use the right words and put them in the right order and construct them in sentences so that you're going to emotively compel the jury to care about your client. That is absolutely your job as a defense attorney. So rhetoric is kind of the surface of language. It's the sophistry component of how we interact. And the thing that I want to point out in this episode, and the thing we're going to look at in the next segment with the Socratic portion of the show, we'll be looking at a certain text where Socrates is talking with a friend, and his friend is reciting this speech to him. And Socrates, he makes a point that even though the person who gave the speech spoke in a very eloquent and compelling manner, he doesn't think that makes the substance of the speech any more interesting or coherent than it is. And he doesn't think it's very coherent when he sort of examines it. So we'll get to that in the next segment. And I want to point this out at the top of the show and lay this foundation so that we have this understanding just going forward, that this is an important concept to have in your brain, that trying to sincerely engage with a crowd or with a person and actually having a sincere motive, that's a good question. How do we judge people's motives? How do we actually know that, Yolanda or Steve or Jerome, whoever we're talking to, actually does have the good intention that they say they have? How do we know that they're not just playing the game of human deception and engaging in trying to sort of skim off the top and be a rent seeker in this sense? They're not really contributing to the overall moral good. They're just sort of allowing everyone else to be, as good as they want to be, and just sort of lying and deceiving when it suits them, but saying all the while that they have great intentions. How do we know? How do we judge that, right? That's a very good question. And with this episode, we're going to look at how can we identify rhetoric? How can we understand rhetoric to be not only a tool for people seeking to deceive others, but also a tool for the good and a tool for having decent arguments? But also I want to make it very clear that this is also essential for critical thinking. If you don't have a concept of rhetoric, you're going to look at, politicians, you're going to see them as actual sincere actors, right? When they're talking on to the media or when they're holding their rallies, you're going to look at them and say, wow, this is part of the game when it comes to exciting people and getting people mobilized. And that's fair enough. But here's one example. I'm not trying to make any political points, so let me just make that clear. But if you saw this in the news, there was a recent event that happened in United States politics where Donald Trump gave his State of the Union address, which is the speech the president gives a yearly, where he gives a sort of recap of what's going on. And Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Speaker of the House, ripped up her copy of the speech, or ripped up a copy. I don't know the details about if there's only one copy. I don't know how sacred the document is. So I'm an Australian, I'm an Aussie. I don't think we would care at all if anything happened like that. I mean, our Prime Minister brought a clump of coal into Parliament, and no one seemed to care about that. So I think we're a bit more dramatic over here, and we don't really mind getting a bit raunchy in politics. But I think this really made the point for me, because they found out later through this different view of Nancy Pelosi, the sort of camera behind her, they actually saw that she had pre-ripped the speech. So she had sort of made the incisions on the speech so that when she went to rip it at the end, it would sort of tear easily. And this, doesn't that say it all? Why? I understand if there's some moment where she hears the speech and she is so disgusted by the content of that speech that she has this reaction, and then that becomes some event where we point to and say, wow, this politician really had an emotive moment that we can all look at and be excited about. But it's the planning, it's the preparation that one knows is going to do this performance at the end with 100% certainty. Like, it doesn't matter what the speech is going to be, I'm going to do this little sort of, I don't know. I used to love, wrestling as a kid, WWE, and it almost reminds me of like a stunt they would pull where there's like a really close match and the guy's about to be pinned, but then all of a sudden, The Rock's music, Stone Cold's music kicks in and he's running to the ring, and it just changes the moment, right? Changes everything about the tone of what's going on. People get confused in this area, especially politics, right? Not only to mention other realms of knowledge where rhetoric can confuse us, but politics especially. Rhetoric is ultimately completely tied up with the idea that it seems to be difficult. It's getting more and more difficult to have that cross-party conversation where we can actually just, at the end of the day, come to some decision. Because I think if you're of my generation, if you're born in the I think the 90s or the noughties, I think what you've kind of grown up with is politicians who are mostly focused on rhetorical games in the media. Not to suggest that there aren't any great politicians out there doing amazing work. I'm not. Don't clip that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just simply pointing out that, to the 21st century consumer of media, it can be very confusing, and the landscape is often difficult to navigate if one doesn't understand the differences between how to identify just mere flowery language and misuses of people's genuine interest and genuine loyalty to certain ideas and certain people. And people become, I think, and I totally empathize, people become, I think, desensitized and disconnected from the overall process. And that is I think that's the nihilism sort of feeling that sits in there that we have also covered on this show. And we want to try to avoid that. We actually want to have these conversations insofar as we can have them. Okay, and that's how I see this. I mean, it's kind of a dichotomy, but I don't like dualisms, so let's not call it that. But certainly there's a difference between rhetoric and actually having a genuine argument, actually having a coherent idea worth sharing, and really having an integral and really important thing worth sharing. How do we identify the differences between that? We're going to look at some Socratic excerpts in this episode and some a little commentary after that as well. Stay tuned.
MC.
All I wanted to be was an inner MC.
The inner MC.
All I wanted to be was an inner MC. All I wanted to be was an inner MC.
The inner MC.
Welcome back to Socratic Smarts, listener. In this segment of the show, we're going to keep looking at rhetoric here, this idea that, not only are we more sensitive to the fact that we have to use rhetoric in our lives to marshal an argument for ourselves, don't we, right? We have to, if we want the job, if you want that promotion, whatever it is, whatever you want out of life, you have to marshal an argument. You have to come up with a way to convince others that what you're saying is going to be true, and not only what you're saying is true, but it's the best way forward, and you are someone who's having a good idea and someone who ought to be listened to, right? All of that relates to your ability to speak, your ability to use rhetoric and to connect with the rhythm of language such that you can really convince someone and compel someone to your point of view. So not only is rhetoric important from this perspective, when we're acknowledging that we have to, think critically about our own positions and try to speak, but also with the sensitivity to the idea that we want to be truthful as well. We're not really sure when other people are using rhetoric. It's hard to tell, isn't it, listener? It's hard to tell if someone really believes what they think, or are they just appealing to high-minded, you might say, motives, and using that as a rhetorical shield, some sort of bubble that prevents criticism because the rhetoric is so it's exactly right. They're saying all the right words, they're appealing to all the right emotions, but then we look at their behavior, or we look at if they're a politician, we look at their policies, and maybe that contradicts what they say, and that is more of a reliable measure for what they actually believe, what they're actually intending to do. Before we get into some Socratic excerpts, which will explore these ideas some more, we should just look at Athens here. We're just going to look at what rhetoric and what the oratory tradition was in Athens, what was going on there with respect to how much they valued the skill of speaking, of orating. And this comes from J.W. Roberts in The City of Socrates, an introduction to classical Athens. He says, on the topic of how rhetoric develops, he says, quote, "Closely linked with the development of anthropology and psychology was that of rhetoric, the theory of oratory. In part, the new subject merely analyzed and systematized the best existing practice, but in part, it exploited new knowledge. The case against the new subject of rhetoric was later put with force in Plato's Phaedrus. Sicilian rhetoricians saw that probability was more to be esteemed than truth. In jury courts, no attention at all was paid to morality, only to plausibility." End quote. So I think what we get there, like what's kind of underscored by Roberts here, is he's pointing out that, there is this difference between what you can be convinced of and what is true. Even in the days of Athens, they were aware of this distinction because they were very familiar with the idea that, you could get up on a pedestal and convince a bunch of plebeians, a bunch of the lower class. You could convince them of anything, right? As long as you spoke with eloquence and you said the right things to get the crowd on your side. Even if you can do that, it doesn't lend any truth to the idea that what you're saying is the right way forward, or what you're saying has any intrinsic truth just because people like what you're saying. And so there's this kind of tension here between maybe sometimes the thing which is true isn't always going to be the best thing that people want to hear. People like rhetoric that is going to make them feel good and make them feel good about how they're behaving and what they're going to be doing in the future. Makes a sort of atmosphere of positivity and optimism, even if that positivity and optimism isn't grounded in anything politically or morally true. Let's go back to Roberts here. He says, quote, "Insofar as rhetoric aimed in Protagoras' phase to make the weaker argument the stronger, it was eminently unscientific. But it did develop alongside anthropology and psychology, and it did promote interest in other reputable subjects such as the art of argument. Rhetoric, although not the invention of the sophists, was the principal subject offered by Protagoras and his successors. It was the most practical or relevant of all subjects. Whether anyone had taught rhetoric to Pericles or not, there had clearly been good speakers before the invention of rhetoric, but oratory was becoming increasingly important in Athens. The introduction of radical democracy had meant the decisions affecting the community were taken much more publicly than before. Matters that might have once been settled quietly between influential friends were now debated publicly before thousands in the assembly and before hundreds in jury courts. It was by their oratory that a few might hope to control the many. Young men knew that they could hardly hope to succeed, as the community judged success unless they could speak effectively, and that if they could speak effectively, they might be able to trump the experience of their elders. End quote. So the point that he is making there, that Roberts is highlighting for us, is that even in Athens, where you do have this rich, it is supposed to be the foundation of philosophy, and philosophy is supposed to be the root of rational critical thinking. Even in this city where everything is supposedly, has to be rational, we have to think it through, we have to try to be logical about this and appease the philosophy that, we can try to do this logically and talk it out. Even in that city, even in that period, you still could get away with putting together rhetoric and putting together certain phrases and sort of having a rhythm to how you're saying it that's compelling. There are many people who would be taken in by the young, bullish up-and-comer who is more or less talking a lot of game when it comes to the, debates, but hasn't really shown that sort of virtue, hasn't really demonstrated in a practical way that we might need it to be totally validated if we wanted to say that person really is courageous or really is virtuous and brave, right? And there's also just this idea, again, that, this isn't really an art form that the lower class, uneducated citizens would have been in touch with, and so they really can't separate the wheat from the chaff. They don't know a good argument from a bad one, and as we mentioned in the quote before, there is this idea that sophistry and rhetoric is, if you wanted to take the worst interpretation of it, is simply just about making the weaker argument the stronger, which, if you remember as well, that was one of the charges that is put to Socrates during his trial in the Apology. Just the concept, I think, as well, is just kind of funny, I suppose, of trying to make the weaker argument the stronger. I mean, surely that's kind of a contradiction. If the argument that prevails, whatever argument that, is compelling in the end, surely that is the stronger argument. And, you're some sort of, you're doing witchcraft or something. You're doing some sort of magic with language when you use rhetoric, such that you're able to make things which are weaker and untrue seem more true and actually seem real. So a good example of that today would be all the ways in which prejudice is spread just for political advancement, you might say. And so in this way, there is perhaps a lot of similarities here, listener, in our political current situation and the Athenian one that they had to deal with lots of people claiming that they knew what they were talking about. Let's go back to Roberts. He says, quote, "Selling a service was not highly regarded in Athens, though that is not to say that it was generally despised. The sophists sold their services and were despised by some, such as Anytus, Socrates, and Plato. The reason can hardly have been merely that the service they sold was teaching. The Xenophontic Socrates felt that to charge fees restricted a teacher's choice of pupils and subjects. The Platonic Socrates was induced by his divine sign to turn certain former pupils away, but eminent sophists like Protagoras and Hippias could choose their pupils and subjects. It must be a question of what they taught. The one subject they all taught was rhetoric, but that, as we have seen, involved more than the study of logico-linguistic tricks and figures of speech. In teaching rhetoric, in the wide sense of the word, they were teaching political advancement, and since politics was the most admired activity, they could claim, and apart from Gorgias did claim, to be teaching success in life, or arete. Plato makes Socrates say to Protagoras, "You openly proclaim yourself to the whole of Greece, gave yourself the name of sophist, declared yourself a teacher of culture and arete, and were the first to ask a fee in return. To Socrates, who had no high regard for the traditional informal instruction, the notion of selling in arete was abhorrent. There is something abhorrent about selling instruction in it, certainly for large fees." End quote. That last point that Roberts makes is quite the compelling one, I think, and this idea of arete came up a few times in his passage there. It's this idea, it's a Greek term, it kind of means virtue or bravery is probably the best translations, I think, that I've found, but it also kind of means maximum effectiveness, so sort of maximum potential. You're not letting anything in terms of your opportunity cost. You're not just wasting your time. You're really pursuing the greatness of your life, and that becomes your function. And what he's making that point at the end, Roberts is saying that one of the reasons, you might say, why someone like Socrates, who didn't charge for his teachings and also thought he had nothing really valuable to teach, and anyone who charged for teaching in this way, sophists, that term at the time meant a kind of teacher. It didn't necessarily have to do specifically with rhetoric, but what we're saying is that rhetoric was primarily important because politics was hugely important in the Athenian life, and to be a prominent politician who could compel others to come to their side, to listen to their ideas, and to, most of all, maybe serve as their army if there ever was a case where they needed to, have people loyal to, for any sort of interpersonal conflict within the city, right? There were many incentives to be a powerful master of language and arguments in general, but also to make sure that you came across as virtuous and as thoughtful as you can. And so in this way, there seems to be almost a tension, you might say, between the Socratic idea of ignorance that we've looked at on this show, which is that you should be interested in your own ignorance and trying to find that ignorance in yourself and others, because that's how we all get wiser. There seems to be a tension with that and the idea of rhetoric, especially if we're aspiring to always speak clearly and have the point of view that is going to be emotionally compelling. There's almost something about that where you can't have a nuanced point of view, or if you can, you have to be very talented about how you present it and keep people engaged. Because I don't know about you, listener, but I think if you look at the situation that we have in politics, a lot of it can be explained by the idea that people like extreme point of views. It seems like that kind of is what bolsters the most support. That's how people get out of their houses and get to the picket line and get into the voting booth, is that you want to have a strong opinion. You want to have that emotive opinion. It seems in contradiction to having that vibrant emotive response to have a sort of nuanced rational point of view that maybe is more clearly thought out but isn't as appealing to people. It doesn't get people excited, right? And this is why there's a kind of delicate balance that politicians might have to play with, and people who use rhetoric and lawyers and stuff. You might have to think about this from a very deep perspective and sort of figuring out what is the tension between simply using rhetoric to convince someone of something and how that is interplaying with what's actually true, what is actually the fact of the matter, and what do you actually believe? What are you actually trying to generate as the consequences of this situation? If we convince this person that what you're saying is right, what will be the consequences? Are we actually going to further some real goal worth furthering, or are we just sort of doing it again, as Roberts points out, for some political goal, for some career advancement, for some, cronyism, something like that, where we're just basically obsessed with our own reputation and power in the realm of social coercion. And so with that said, we'll take a break and go into some Socratic excerpts from the Phaedrus. Stay tuned.
And an experiencer. You don't need a thought, and then to have a thought you have to have a thinker, or to have a thinker then you can have a thought. All I'm introducing you to, you see, is really a simplified language. Do you feel a feeling? Or is feeling a feeling the same thing as feeling? It's easier, isn't it, to say feeling instead of feeling a feeling? There was a faith healer of Deal who said, though pain is not real, When the point of a pin goes into my skin, I dislike what I fancy I feel.
Welcome back to Socratic Smarts, listener. In the final segment of the show, we're looking at the Phaedrus. And the Phaedrus, of course, named after the character in the dialogue, Socrates and Phaedrus. They are sitting under a tree and there's a river going by. It's one of the more scenic dialogues where we get this sort of idea that it's just two friends, two companions sort of stopping under a tree for some shade while they wait for the sun to go down. And they're just chatting. They're just having a little discussion. And it's on the topic of love, and in particular, Phaedrus has a speech that Socrates would like to hear. And so Phaedrus gives this speech to Socrates. He's relaying it from another person who gave a speech on love. And Socrates, while he is engaged with the speech and he appreciates the rhetoric and the way that the speech is very eloquently expressed, he sort of responds to Phaedrus after he relays this speech to him about the nature of the question that the speech deals with is it better to love someone who doesn't love you? Should you direct your love towards people who don't love you? Because people who are in love with you, it is claimed in the speech, are sort of like under a spell. They're a bit mad. And love can be seen as a kind of madness. It sort of takes you over. And you can imagine in the city of Athens, where magic was probably more prominent, at least the idea that it could be real, love can be viewed as a sort of god that takes you over and makes you crazy, makes you mad, and that sort of impairs your decision making, impairs your ability to be rational, you know? So this is how Socrates responds to Phaedrus's speech. He says to Phaedrus, quote, "Phaedrus, the speech you carried with you here, it was horrible. As horrible as the speech you made me give. Phaedrus, how could that be? It was foolish and close to being impious. What could be more horrible than that? Nothing, if of course what you say is right. Well then, don't you believe that love is the son of Aphrodite? Isn't he one of the gods? This is certainly what people say. Well, Lysias certainly doesn't, and neither does your speech, which you charmed me through your potion into delivering myself. But if love is a god, or something divine, which he is, he can't be bad in any way, and yet our speeches just now spoke of him as if he were. That is their offence against love, and they've compounded it with their utter foolishness in parading their dangerous falsehoods and preening themselves over perhaps deceiving a few silly people and coming to be admired by them. And so, my friend, I must purify myself." End quote. So Socrates is noticing this problem where just because, Lysias is the person who gave the speech that Phaedrus relayed to Socrates, just because he was able to convince people that it was a great premise to love people who don't love you, and just because he was able to get some admirers for that teaching within the context of when he gave the speech and people agreed with him at the time, just because all of that is the case, doesn't mean that there is anything true about what he said, doesn't mean there's anything useful about what he said. And Socrates actually thinks that at the center of what he's saying, there really is no truth. And because of his, what we've discussed about Socratic ignorance and how that's central to any understanding of what truth ought to be, what knowledge ought to be, from the Socratic perspective, he really wants to know what's true. As opposed to what people will get excited about, what people want to hear. And so he responds, quote, this is Socrates going back to our boy, and he is going to give his version of how he would approach the speech. And he's giving this as if he were talking to some imaginary young boy that he's explaining love to. He says, quote, "There is no truth to that story, that when a lover is available, you should give your favors to a man who doesn't love you instead, because he is in control of himself when the lover has lost his head. That would have been fine to say if madness were bad, pure, and simple. But in fact, the best things we have come from madness, when it is given as a gift of the god. The prophetess of Delphi and the priestess of Dodona are out of their minds when they perform that fine work of theirs for all of Greece, either for an individual person or for the whole city. But they accomplish little or nothing when they are in control of themselves. The people who designed our language in the old days never thought of madness as something to be ashamed of or worthy of blame. Otherwise, they would not have used the word manic for the finest experts of all, the ones who tell the future, thereby weaving insanity into prophecy. End quote. So his response is getting to the heart of what Lysias was going to argue. And so Socrates is saying, well, look, maybe you're going to claim that love is a kind of delusion. It's a kind of madness, especially the passionate love that we're familiar with, the sort of craving love, not the open acceptance where you're just sort of taking, whoever the person is as they are, but this idea that you're sort of craving their attention, extreme form of attachment. Socrates says, well, look, if you didn't have that madness, life might be a boring thing. We might not get anything done. Maybe it's weird to call this madness a bad thing because there are many ways in which this kind of chaotic energy does good things and gets things done for whatever reason, allows us to pursue things, allows us to form relationships, allows us to accomplish our goals, whatever it may be. But Socrates is just simply pointing out that this sort of, just because you're pointing out that love is a kind of madness, it's an emotional thing, doesn't make it necessarily bad or intrinsically malicious. It's just simply how it is. And so we're looking at now how Socrates sees the morality of written work. He wants to make the case that there is something empty about the fact that when we put our writings down, when we put our rhetoric down on paper, it becomes a different thing. It becomes something no longer responsive to the criticisms that we might be able to put at it in real time if it were a conversation or a speech, right? With some questions at the end, a Q&A segment, right? You don't get that in a book, or you don't get that in a document of any kind. And we should point out the reason why we don't have any writings of Socrates is because we can assume he exactly took this position towards writing where he didn't really see it as being a fruitful exercise. This is in obviously the very early days of developing literature and developing writing, popular writing anyway. And so Socrates says to the topic here, quote, he says, well then, we ought to examine the topic we just proposed now. When is a speech well written and delivered, and when is it not? Won't someone who is to speak well and nobly have in mind the truth about the subject he is going to discuss? Phaedrus. What I have actually heard about this, Socrates, my friend, is that it is not necessary for the intending orator to learn what is really just, but only what will seem just to the crowd who will act as judges, nor again what is really good or noble, but only what will seem so. For that is what persuasion proceeds from, not truth. Anything that wise men say, Phaedrus, is not lightly to be cast aside. We must consider whether it might be right, and what you just said in particular must not be dismissed. Let's look at it this way then. Suppose I were trying to convince you that you should fight your enemies on horseback, and neither one of us knew what a horse is, but I happen to know this much about you, that Phaedrus believes a horse is a tame animal with the longest ears. But that would be ridiculous, Socrates. Not quite yet, actually, but if I was seriously trying to convince you, having a composed speech in praise of the donkey, in which I call it a horse and claim that having such an animal is of immense value, both at home and in military service, that it is good for fighting and for carrying your baggage, and that it is useful for much else besides, well, that would be totally ridiculous. Well, which is better, to be ridiculous and a friend, or clever and an enemy? The former. And so, when a rhetorician who does not know good from bad addresses a city which knows no better and attempts to sway it, not praising a miserable donkey as if it were a horse, but bad as if it were good, and having studied what the people believe, persuades them to do something bad instead of good, with that as its seed, what sort of crop do you think rhetoric can harvest? A crop of really poor quality. But could it be, my friend, that we have mocked the art of speaking more rudely than it deserves? For it might perhaps reply, what bizarre nonsense! Look, I am not forcing anyone to learn how to make speeches without knowing the truth. On the contrary, my advice for what it's worth is to take me up only after mastering the truth. But I do make this boast, even someone who knows the truth couldn't produce conviction on the basis of a systematic art without me. Well, is that a fair reply? Yes, it is. If, that is, the arguments now advancing upon rhetoric testify that it is an art. For it seems to me, as I hear certain arguments approaching and protesting, that is a lie, and that rhetoric is not an art but an artless practice. As the Spartans said, there is no genuine art of speaking without a grasp of truth, and there never will be. End quote. And that says it all, I think, doesn't it? That sort of gives you the Socratic perspective right there, that yes, rhetoric has this very useful and deep potential to make a crowd, to make a population actually listen to you, whatever collection of humans you're dealing with. Rhetoric is a way in which you can confidently convey some amount of ideas, some amount of content in a way that you know is going to actually emotionally get people energized, interested, and engaged with what's going on. So leaders who are actually in these positions of responsibility, mastering rhetoric, mastering communication is utterly essential to having that tool, because if you don't have it, you're not going to be able to, even if the truth is on your side, you won't be able to marshal the case. You won't be able to make it a reality. And so a lot of the combative news cycle, which falls into dualistic fallacies of only having two different arguments about one issue, they can make it seem as if there's some deep debate going on. But anyone who looks at it knows that there's truth on many sides of any issue. And the idea that we just are going to use rhetoric to only portray the idea that there's just two opinions on the matter, just a dualistic perspective, and if you don't adopt one of the two opinions, then you're not in the arena or something. That is the enemy of having a nuanced, true perspective, and just sort of see the world more clearly, if that's the goal that we're looking for, to live that examined Socratic lifestyle insofar as we can. Obviously, it's not the easiest thing in the world, and look, I mean, if this was our natural state, if this was the natural condition of human beings, which is to say, to be oriented towards truth and happiness, then, well, life would look differently. So, obviously, this isn't our natural state. We have to put a lot of work into identifying the differences between rhetoric and sincerity, truth and mere language games. And the more that we're able to do that within ourselves and within the news cycle, the media landscape we find ourselves, I think hopefully the dialogue, the conversations around these issues will hopefully improve. And that seems like a good spot to leave it there, guys. If you enjoyed this episode and you have any feedback or questions for the topic today, please get in contact at socraticsmarts@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your feedback. But that's going to be it. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode on the rules of rhetoric. I've been Pneumatic J, and we'll see you next time.
Here is the part. Here is the part.
Chop the volume and go down on the other side. Pick up it from. And this is the annual reading of the script.
Here is the part. Here is the part.
I went back and I looked. What did I really see? I'm thinking about my sight and whether this is quite authentic.